Hi everyone, this is Hillary from New Jersey LCV and Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. You've already been hearing Rita from TDRW, Rita Yelda, doing a little bit of the pre-webinar housekeeping stuff. So Rita has just turned on the recording button to record this afternoon's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Today, Rita Yelda is going to be talking about and I know for a fact that Rita has many, many years of experience doing this, so we are very lucky to be hearing from an expert on this. Rita is recording this, so if you want to be able to share this with your colleagues at a later date, that will be available. Before we jump in, I'm going to give you a brief overview of New Jersey LCV and Pennsylvania and Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, and what we can provide to partners in Delaware River Watershed. Rita's going to do a brief overview of the resources that she can provide to watershed partners. And then she's going to present for about 40 minutes, and at the end there will be plenty of time for questions and answers. Just FYI, in the past we've had some issues with audio and feedback, so sort of as we're going through the webinar, if you have questions, you can just plug them into the Zoom group chat, and we'll ask those at the end. Although if there are some questions that seem particularly, like are about a very particular slide, we might be able to stop and answer those then, but otherwise we'll do questions at the end. So that's a brief overview of where we're going this afternoon. Just a brief intro about New Jersey LCV and Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. I just see a message from someone saying that there are some extraneous sounds. So I think everybody should be muted, except for me. Rita, I'm just going to mute you very briefly, and hopefully that gets better. Oh, and there's somebody else saying that you don't have audio. You may need to call into the phone line if you're having trouble hearing. And I actually just realized I said that out loud, so she can't hear. So hopefully those folks will. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm glad that the sound is better now. So briefly, the 30-minute summary of New Jersey LCV and Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, 30-second, I should say, overview of what we can provide to watershed partners. Our mission with our work with watershed partners is to provide support that allows you to build your capacity to reach the audiences that you want to know about your mission and your work. We do that by a variety of digital and in-person organizing tools, everything from helping you reach out to your audience to get them to come to events, to promoting policy and issues that you want to get in front of your supporters, to doing webinars and other trainings like this one that give you the tools you need to do your work more effectively and efficiently. I also, as the social media strategist for CVPA and New Jersey LCV, provide one-on-one social media consulting completely free of charge to watershed organizations. So that's a very brief plug for the work that we do, and if you have questions, feel free to reach out. And I'm going to pass it over to Rita Yelda to take it over.
All right, can you all hear me okay?
I can hear you.
All right, great. So let's get started. Thank you so much, Hillary, for that intro. I wanted to also just kind of give a brief intro for the Coalition for the Delaware River Watersheds Communications Work Group. So if you are a member of the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed, we do have a communications work group. You can join, you can ask your communications manager or the person who does your social media to join the work group. We have a monthly call. And we also have an email list to share updates and questions. Really, our main goal with the work group is to leverage our collective communication assets to support common priorities and elevate the status of the Delaware River watershed, elevate the status of the Delaware River, its tributaries, on social media and other means of communication. It's also a way of providing technical assistance and training. We put together webinars like this one, and then we also create shareable communications materials that highlight the watershed for all of our members to use. So if you are a member of the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed, you are more than welcome to join us on that monthly call and in the work group. I'll have my email at the end of this, so you can just send me an email if you're interested. Or you can go to our website and you'll find my email on there. So that is my shameless plug. So for most of this presentation, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end unless there's something super, super pressing. You can type it into the chat box. We're going to do the Q&A through the chat because of background noise and things like that that we've experienced in the past. So thank you for joining today's webinar, Writing Letters to the Editor and Op-eds that Get Published. Now, I'm your host, Rita Yelda, and I am the Outreach and Communications Manager for the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. Our coalition represents over 140 conservation, policy, and wilderness organizations throughout the Delaware River Basin states. I've held advocacy and communications positions with nonprofits since 2011. And I wrote my first letter to the editor that same year. And since then, I've run multiple trainings on writing LTEs and op-eds with staff members, volunteers, and grasstops leaders. I've learned a lot of tips and tricks, and I'm really excited to share with you what I've learned firsthand over the past 8 years. So today we're going to be discussing how to write an opinion piece with impact and best practices for formatting and submitting the piece to really elevate your chances of publication. Trying to get my slides to work here. Go, slides. There we go. Okay. So writing an opinion piece, which would be an LTE or an op-ed, letter to the editor op-ed for a newspaper, is a way to get thousands of eyes on an issue that's important to your organization. It's a way to educate. It's a way to influence, and in fact, the opinion page is one of the most frequently read sections of any newspaper. It's only second to, if you can believe it or not, the horoscopes. So opinion pieces harness the power of the media in order to educate communities, put pressure on decision makers, move people to action, and shape public opinion. Oftentimes, legislators read the opinion pages to see what their constituents care about, and also to get a pulse of the community. If a legislator is mentioned in an opinion piece, which we'll discuss more later, you bet that they are going to read it. So you can spend thousands of dollars on ad space in a newspaper, or you can write an opinion piece pretty easy and get it published for free. So what's the difference? So an LTE and an op-ed, they are both opinion pieces, but they're a little bit different. An LTE, or a letter to the editor, can be submitted by all community members. Anybody can submit one. Your average Joe Schmo can submit a letter to the editor. They're typically shorter. They're 200 to 400 words. They can be written in response to a news story recently printed, but they do not have to respond to anything. They can stand on their own. And an LTE will often skim the surface of a topic and then give your opinion. Meanwhile, the op-ed, the opinion editorial, they're typically written by somebody with some kind of expertise. So if you work for a conservation or environmental organization, that's you. You have expertise. Whether you're a policymaker, a conservationist, a scientist, a CEO, a director, somebody with some kind of expertise is typically going to write an opinion editorial. They're also longer. Op-eds are typically 600 to 800 words. They also can be written in response to a news story that was recently printed, but they do not have to. They can also stand on their own. And the op-ed really goes more in depth on a topic, while an LTE is just kind of skimming the surface, giving your opinion. It's maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs. An op-ed is really going in depth on a topic, giving all the necessary background, and it ends up being quite longer. All right, so when should you write an op-ed or LTE? So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of like some tips on how to write them and some structure and things like that. But first, I wanted to chat about when. Should you be writing one right now? Should you have written one last week? Should you be writing one in 2 months? So I want to talk about some opportunities for when you could write an op-ed or an LTE. There are many opportunities to write opinion pieces, and I've listed just a few of them here. So first, you might want to write to support a piece of public policy. Opinion pieces can be used to advocate for or against policy. It can also include an ask for people to reach out to their legislators about an issue. So think strategically. What does your organization have going on right now? Is there a bill in need of support and a letter to the editor can educate people about it? Do you want to write an op-ed moving residents to call their state senator? Do you need a specific legislator to co-sponsor a bill? If so, consider writing an LTE or op-ed that will be placed in a newspaper that serves that district, that legislator's district, and therefore will reach that legislator's constituents. As I mentioned, if you call a legislator out by name, you can bet that they are going to read it. Their staff likely has Google alerts set for their boss's name. And don't be afraid to call legislators out by name and hold them accountable so they take action on an issue. Of course, you want to stay civil and polite. When it comes to decision makers, though, it's okay to name names. Keep it civil, like I said, and never call out an individual who is not a public figure. If you are really mad at your neighbor, do not write an LTE or op-ed targeting your neighbor. It's a little bit different because a legislator is a public figure. So you can name names if they are a public figure. You can also write an LTE or op-ed when your organization has a new initiative or project that will impact the community. Just keep in mind that your opinion piece should make the larger case about how your organization's update will impact readers. For example, an op-ed about your youth services organization meeting its fundraising goals would only be impactful if it included details on how those funds will go toward improving local parks or other programs for the area's children. Or if your conservation organization just opened a new nature center, explain in the opinion piece what new opportunities that creates for readers. Think about that friend that you have that always talks about themselves and always pats themselves on the back, and think about how annoying that is. Don't be that person in the opinion pages. Your opinion piece is more likely to get published if you're not just bragging about your organization, but instead tying it to the larger impact. And I know we're not talking about press releases in this presentation, but the same goes for press releases. Talk about the bigger impact. You just met your fundraising goal. How is that going to impact the community? You just opened a new nature center. How is that going to impact the community? Your LTE or op-ed shouldn't just be patting yourself on the back. Next, many organizations write LTEs and op-eds to increase the public's familiarity with their organization and to be seen as thought leaders in the subject area in which they write, such as climate change, open space preservation, any other topic that you consistently are writing about. Writing opinion pieces and getting them published regularly highlights your organization and then poses you as a leading voice on that topic. You can also write a letter to the editor or an op-ed to educate specific publics. You may want to educate voters or students or any other population about an issue impacting them. We'll talk about target audiences later in this presentation. There's also always an opportunity to write an opinion piece when there's something in the news that your organization wants to weigh in on. You can relate it to what's happening. You can relate to what's happening in the news right now to a topic that your organization cares about. That makes the opinion piece timely. So for example, a news article published in NJ Spotlight that's focused on recent flooding is a great opportunity to submit an opinion piece to NJ Spotlight that talks about climate change and what your organization is working on around the issue. I see that there's a comment in the chat. Hillary, if there's anything that you want to chime in, and if there's a comment or a question, I totally welcome that. Okay. So your LTE or op-ed can also discuss an upcoming holiday or anniversary. This also adds timeliness to your opinion piece. So for example, you can use Plastic-Free July as an opportunity to write about the need to ban single-use plastics in Pennsylvania. Or you can use Christmas as an opportunity to write about toxic chemicals in children's toys. So think about what's happening on the calendar, what's coming up, how can you tie it to an issue that your organization cares about. Finally, you can write an LTE or op-ed in response to a recent newspaper article or editorial. So if the newspaper totally got something wrong, you can write an opinion piece that corrects them. On the other hand, if the newspaper recently wrote an article or editorial in favor of an issue or topic you care about, you can write a positive opinion piece. Use the article or editorial that the newspaper initially published as an opportunity to write a response using an LTE or op-ed. That will keep the topic in the newspaper for even longer. This increases the number of eyes reading about the topic. If you're going to write in response to a previous article or editorial, just be sure that you're writing and including the name and the date of the article you're responding to. So I've included a little example of that here on the screen. So if you're writing in response to a previous editorial or article, mention that you are writing in response to that. There's no hard and fast rules on how to do that, but just the date and including the name of the article you're responding to is very helpful. Just remember, though, that you want your letter to the editor or op-ed to be accessible to everyone who reads it, so make sure it can stand on its own. Don't assume that others have read the previous article or editorial that you're citing. Make sure you give all of that needed background. Also, I do not suggest writing an LTE or op-ed in response to another guest author's LTE or op-ed. Typically, newspapers do not want to see a fight break out in their opinion pages. All right, so I have a few questions to think about before you start writing. Hang on, let me take a drink of water. All right, so it might be tempting to write a letter to the editor or op-ed for a newspaper that represents multiple counties, an entire region of a state, maybe an entire state. But really, do not overlook small, hyper-local community newspapers, especially because they may serve the community that you want to reach. Before you start writing, think about who your target audience is. Then write for a newspaper that will reach that audience. So for example, if you're running a campaign at Rutgers University to reduce plastic water bottles on campus, writing an opinion piece for the school's newspaper would probably be the right choice, as opposed to writing something that serves, half of the state. Another example, if there is a legislator who is not supportive of your, let's say, your citywide campaign to stop a landfill from being built, You might want to identify which city newspapers serve their constituency and write a letter to the editor or op-ed for that newspaper so that it is reaching their constituents. It's also often easier to get published in these smaller newspapers because there's just less competition than a newspaper that serves several counties or an entire region of a state. Next, consider your focus of the LTE or op-ed. Pick one topic you want to write about and then elaborate on it throughout the letter or op-ed using your opinion, recent data, and potentially a story. Don't deviate too much from your main argument or you might lose your audience. Explain your issue clearly and briefly give the necessary background information, as readers might not know much about the topic and you want your letter, again, to be accessible or op-ed to be accessible. To drive home your argument, it's really helpful to have 1 or 3 statistics, reports, data, papers, studies to cite. Just make sure that you're using the most recent available data. Don't use a study from 1994 if there's a version from 2014. Also, don't overwhelm your piece with numbers and statistics, but adding just a few will give further legitimacy to your argument. Remember that the letter should focus more on your point of view than data or studies, but it is helpful to have a couple of things that you're going to include in there, a few facts and figures. Next, think about if you have a short personal story you can tell in the letter to the editor or op-ed that will add impact. Stats and numbers can only get you so far in convincing people of your point of view, while stories add a human touch and illustrate what's on the line. So for example, if you're working on a campaign to reduce the use of diesel buses to transport kids to school, writing about how your child developed asthma would be a lot more impactful than writing about, all the details of a study that came out last month about diesel buses. Or if you're a farmer that's concerned about water quality, writing about how you use water and what's at stake, what's on the line without you receiving clean water would also be impactful. So think about those personal stories. Do you have anything that you can write about that really drives home what you're trying to say? It's also fine to tell other people's stories. You just want to make sure you have the okay from them. Might be best if you don't use names, but it is okay to tell other people's stories. Finally, you want to make sure that you have a call to action in your LTE or op-ed. What's your overall goal for writing the opinion piece? Think about who your target audience is and what you want them to do. Your call to action can be a consumer choice, something like, don't buy single-use plastic in July. Or you can even ask the public to call your legislator to support Senate Bill 733. So it could be a consumer choice. It could be in support of a piece of policy. Your call to action can also be focused on decision makers. So for example, if you're writing a letter to the editor about banning plastic soda bottles, your call to action might be a couple paragraphs of making your case and then ending it with, and that's why Governor Cuomo must ban single-use plastic bottles in New York State. So the call to action, again, can be focused on a decision maker. And again, you can name names if they are a public figure. All right. So everyone's writing style is different, and this structure is just a suggestion on how you might want to format your letter to the editor or op-ed to make the most impact. This is not hard and fast, but this might be helpful for you if you're stuck in your writing. So you really want to have an engaging first sentence that's going to catch the reader's attention. In your opening paragraph, you're going to express that singular topic, your primary focus that we discussed. That's going to be the focus of your op-ed or LTE. And then you're going to have body paragraphs that include the story, if you have a personal story, back up your main thesis. This is where you're going to include, those 1 to 3 facts, data, research, and you're going to build support for your conclusion. And then your closing paragraph, you're going to reiterate your main point and offer a final epiphany, solution. You definitely want to restate your call to action in your final paragraph and make it very, very clear. You can also include your call to action in the first paragraph if you'd like. You can include it, in different ways throughout the body of your LTE or op-ed. The body is really where you're going to add those compelling facts, tell a story, use data, and so on. And then the conclusion is where you want to leave readers with a clear understanding of your message by reiterating your main point at the end there. And, of course, having a memorable final line helps to keep things in people's mind. But I really find that an engaging first sentence is going to really help people continue to read your LTE or op-ed. You want something that's going to catch people's attention and isn't so dry. So don't make like a data point your first sentence. Make it something that's a little bit more personable, something that's going to catch people's attention. All right, so tips for writing. I have 11 tips for writing today that I want to share with you. Again, most of these things are things I found out firsthand, really by doing the wrong thing and then figuring out, that was the wrong thing. So here are a few tips for writing that I want to go over. First, I want to talk about submission guidelines. So before you start writing, you want to check the newspaper submission guidelines that you are writing for. So again, that's why it's so important to identify who's your target audience and what are your goals before you start writing. So that will tell you which newspaper is correct for you to write to. So check the newspaper submission guidelines before you start writing. Guidelines are usually posted online under the newspaper's opinion section. After you find the submission guidelines, follow them to a T. If the newspaper says 300 words is the limit, follow that limit. Do not go over. You do not want the newspaper editing your opinion piece down because you went over the word limit, or you might not like the edits that they make. And then worst case scenario, the newspaper might also not bother editing down your opinion piece and instead just won't publish it. So adhere to the word limit. Most times nowadays, letters to the editors and op-eds are submitted through email. And to weed out your submission from spam, sometimes the newspaper will even ask you to put LTE submission or op-ed submission or something similar in the email subject line. I advise doing that whether it's required or not. Just so they know that it's not spam, you're not trying to sell them something, and that it is a submission for, their opinion pages. Even just titling the email, opinion pages submission or something like that. Next, writing too little is way better than writing too much. Shorter pieces are more likely to get published just because they take up less room. They're easier to squeeze into a print version of the newspaper, and your best odds of publication are best if your writing is short and direct. Number 3, be sure to include a powerful title on your letter to the editor or op-ed, or the newspaper might name the piece for you. Excuse me. If the newspaper names your letter to the editor or op-ed for you, it might end up misconstruing your main point for writing. And not all newspapers title their LTEs or op-eds, but include a title anyways. Even if you include a title, the newspaper still might change it. Do not be offended. Kind of just comes with the territory. I do have an example of, so I wrote, I think it was an op-ed for NJ Spotlight about pollinators, and I named it something like The Road Less Traveled for Pollinators. And then they decided to change it to a totally different literary reference. And I was like, okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. We still got it published. So don't be offended if the newspaper changes the title of your LTE or op-ed, but it's best to include one in case they do publish the titles. And in fact, the newspaper might actually take liberties with your LTE or op-ed and change around a few sentences, reword information, or even remove sentences. Do not panic. It happens to everyone, and it comes with the territory of writing letters to the editor and op-eds. Number 4, be sure to include local messaging in your letter to the editor or op-ed. This is so super important. I cannot stress how important this is. How is what's going on in your letter to the editor or opinion or op-ed, how is that going to impact the readership of the newspaper? Use local messaging and directly explain how the community will be impacted. That will greatly improve your chances of publication. So for example, a newspaper in Philadelphia isn't going to write a piece about an issue impacting New York City residents. If you're writing about the Delaware River, name tributaries located in the newspaper service area. If you're writing about the need for more parks, mention local parks by name. Again, keep your messaging relevant to the readership of the newspaper for which you are writing. Get specific about how local populations or the local environment will be impacted. Have that local hook. All too often, I have heard back from editors for newspapers saying that, I'm not really sure how this impacts the readership. So make sure that you are making that connection in your writing outright. All right, number 5, make sure what you're writing about is timely. If you're writing about plastic-free July, do not submit the opinion piece in early June or in August. Similarly, if you're writing about policy, the bill needs to be something that wasn't voted on many months ago. If you're referencing something that happened in the news or applying to a previous article in your piece, make sure those things happened recently. Keep the content fresh and relevant to what's happening right now. Next, number 6, newspapers want to fill their opinion pages with LTEs and op-eds written by those that live within their distribution area so that they're representing the community. That's why it's better to write your own local newspapers. And the newspaper is going to know where you live because you're going to submit your address along with the letter to the editor or op-ed, which we will discuss later. Sometimes it's unavoidable, though. You will need to write an LTE or op-ed to a newspaper further away from where you live, especially if you're a larger organization serving many counties or even many states. One way to get around the newspaper's requirements that you live in the community is to ensure that you're using that local messaging that explains the impact on the local community, like I just mentioned. Another option is to get a volunteer or local staff member to author and submit the opinion piece, since they might actually live in the community. All right. So I have some more tips for writing. So for number 7, avoid jargon and too many acronyms. Do you like to read technical information that you don't understand? No one does. So don't use jargon in your letter to the editor or op-ed. Technical terms get confusing really quick, and you don't want your LT or op-ed to be misunderstood. So using terms that perhaps you work with every day, like watershed, estuary, buffers, and so on, might actually alienate your audience. Most people don't know what those things mean. If you need to use a technical term, then also take the time to explain what that term means. Make your writing understandable to the layman. The same thing goes for acronyms. They can be very confusing. I guarantee that readers' eyes will glaze over the second they read a series of acronyms and jargon. Use one acronym if you must, and then of course in parentheses explain what that acronym stands for. Don't take anything for granted. Number 8, instead of just citing data and facts, think about how you can illustrate that same information, but creating a visual as people are writing. So I've given the example here of saying 100 billion plastic bags are used by Americans every year. And maybe instead of saying that, you might write, every year Americans use enough plastic bags to circle the earth 773 times. So it's the same piece of information, just kind of posed a little bit differently and creating a bit of a visual, which is helpful to do when you're writing and you don't have any pictures that you can include or anything like that. Number 9, Present yourself as a knowledgeable source. In your letter to the editor or op-ed, you can even take 1 or 2 sentences to briefly explain your work, your background, your expertise. This will add legitimacy to your writing. Another thing you can do to add legitimacy is to include your title and name of your organization at the bottom of the opinion piece when you're going to submit it. So for example, you can sign it Dan Jones, Volunteer Coordinator, YMCA, Sandra Miola, Director of CDRW. So if you have some kind of title with an organization that lends expertise to the issue in which you're writing, definitely include that title and the name of the organization at the end. Of course, you want to make sure that the organization is okay with you mentioning them. Number 10, hyperlink your data sources. You know how I mentioned to include 1 or 3 pieces of data or current studies in your LTE or op-ed? Be sure to include hyperlinks to those sources when you submit your piece. This makes it easier for the newspaper to fact check what you've written. Oftentimes the newspaper will not publish these hyperlinks, but you can actually see in this example on the right here that NJ Spotlight did. So you can see where it says outweigh fish. That is actually hyperlinked to the source for that fact. Again, including these hyperlinks, they won't always be published, but including the hyperlink allows the newspaper to really fact check and make sure that you're not making stuff up. And my last writing tip for you is to get a second pair of eyes. Ask a colleague or a friend to copy edit your letter to the editor for typos, check for any factual inaccuracy before you submit it. I know sometimes when I'm looking at something for so long, I end up missing, really easy, it's like typos just because I've been staring at it for so long. So make sure you get a second pair of eyes. Okay, so this is a real op-ed in NJ Spotlight that was ghostwritten by me for our director, CDRW's director, Sandra Miola. So NJ Spotlight did some changes to this. They segmented the op-ed out and created a section. So they created where it says plastic above ground and under. They created a section. They also created a kind of subheader line right underneath the date. And again, this is totally normal. They have changed some of our stuff in the past, as I mentioned, but the crux of the issue has, none of that has been altered, and we're still able to get across what we're trying to get across. So take a look at this op-ed. Think about, based on what you just learned about best practices, what did we incorporate in here that I just talked about in the writing tips? Well, first of all, there are definitely 1 to 3 pieces of recent data, and we hyperlink those data sources. So you can see everything that's green is a hyperlink. So we have 3 pieces of data that we hyperlinked. Oh, and it looks like they also hyperlinked to the bill. I'm not sure that we included that, but that's okay in case people want to read the bill. We also use the term watershed, which I know can definitely be kind of jargony. So right afterwards, we explain the 4 states that make up the area to kind of clarify that a bit. We included Sandra's title and organization at the end of this op-ed to add that legitimacy. And while we included data about all 4 watershed states in this op-ed, we definitely had more of the body of the op-ed focus on New Jersey because we wanted to make it local for New Jersey Spotlight readers. And we spend the most time talking about this New Jersey legislation that we're in support of. There's also in this 2 calls to action. One is consumer choice of avoiding plastic during Plastic-Free July, and the other is supporting this bill S2776, which has been introduced to the legislature, and really just giving Senator Bob Smith that boost, showing him that we are supporting him on that bill. This piece is also really timely, right? Because we're referring to Plastic-Free July. It's a global month of action. We're tying it to a holiday. And this was published on July 2nd, and we ended up submitting it the week before because we wanted this to run, as soon as July started so that we could, you really use that plastic-free July messaging. What can be improved in this op-ed that you see? I know that in taking a look at, there's one thing that I would have improved, even though I helped to write this. There's one term that's used that's kind of jargony, and maybe it should have been removed or it should have been explained. There is, I'm trying to see where it is in here, but so it's on this, on the right-hand side in the first paragraph at the end, we say circular economy. I guarantee you most people don't know what a circular economy is. Maybe most of you on this webinar do not know what a circular economy is. So I think maybe we could have done a little bit better there with explaining what that meant. But everything else, we did take the time to explain. We gave the necessary data. We added some legitimacy with the title. And sometimes the newspaper will ask for the picture. So that's how we ended up getting Sandra's picture in here, is because they asked for it. I wouldn't suggest just sending your picture along with an LTE or op-ed. They really should ask for it if they want it. All right. So I have some logistical tips for you guys that can also help to really increase your chances of publication. So it might already say so in the newspaper submission guidelines, but be sure to include your name, address, and phone number in the email with your submission. The newspaper will not publish your address, they will not publish your phone number, but they're asking for your address to ensure that you live within the newspaper's service area. And then they use your phone number because sometimes newspapers will call you to verify that you've actually submitted an opinion piece and somebody else hasn't, done it for you or used your name. More and more though, newspapers are no longer calling people. I've definitely found there to be a steep decline in that, in the last 8 years. But if they do call you, be sure to pick up that call or return that voicemail as soon as possible. They're not gonna, if they call you, they're not gonna publish it until they touch base with you. Also, never send the letter to the editor or op-ed as an attachment. Even if it's a Word document, PDF, anything else, instead, you want to just copy and paste the opinion piece directly into an email. Otherwise, the newspaper might think that your submission is spam or a virus. It will never get open. Also, many newspapers have a policy that you can only have one piece published per 30-day period. So just take note of that. If you're really trying to pose yourself as a thought leader on an issue, you might be able to only write once to that newspaper every 30 days. And sometimes they'll also say a household can only write once to the newspaper and get it published every 30 days. So newspapers want unique, original content that other newspapers have not already published. The newspaper might even do an internet search for key phrases in your opinion piece to make sure it wasn't published elsewhere. So do not submit a piece that's already been published in another newspaper. If your opinion piece hasn't been published in the newspaper for about 2 weeks or so, you submitted it and you waited about 2 weeks, then it's okay to submit the letter to the editor or op-ed to a different newspaper. Again, you want to make sure you're following the newspaper submission guidelines when you do. So if you wrote a 300-word LTE for Star Ledger and they ended up not publishing it, and then you submit it to NJ Spotlight, their LTE submission guidelines might be different. So you may have to shave down 50 words, or you might be able to increase the length of your LTE depending on what their criteria is. So again, make sure that you are checking those guidelines before you submit to a newspaper. But typically you're gonna wait about 10 to 14 days. And if you have not heard back from the newspaper, then it's fair game to pitch to another newspaper. Finally, what many people don't do, but which I am recommending to all of you, is to give a follow-up call to either the opinion pages editor or the newspaper editor, whoever the correct person is that oversees submissions and publication of the opinion pages for that newspaper. You'll probably be able to find their phone number on the website. You may have to call the main line and ask for them specifically if you find their title on the website for the newspaper. Give them a follow-up call, I'd say 2 to 3 days after submitting your letter to the editor or op-ed. If they gave you no response, if they don't give you a response, give them, as I said, give them a call. And essentially, you just want to ask them two things. You want to ask them, did you receive my opinion piece? If so, is it being considered for publication? It is really important to talk to them because sometimes the feedback you receive from this call makes all the difference in getting your piece published. For example, I had a newspaper, I called one time, I had a newspaper tell me that my op-ed was too long and they would not publish it. They obviously didn't want to edit it down for me, and so they just said, we're not publishing it, it's too long. That was an easy fix. I made the edits, I resubmitted it, and it was published. That's information I never would have found out had I not called them. Another time, I followed up on an LTE, and the newspaper editor told me that they just couldn't understand why their readership would care about the topic that I wrote about. So in that case, you might need to be prepared to kind of advocate, kind of pitch your piece a little bit to them. You might have to explain why your piece matters to their readers. But if you do what I mentioned earlier, where you're including that local messaging, then that really should kind of nip that concern in the bud. So again, local messaging matters. I'm confident that, if you follow these best practices that I've taught you about today, that you'll get your opinion piece placed in no time. But just note that I don't offer a money-back guarantee because this is a free webinar. That is a joke. Okay, so do we have any questions?
It looks like there is one question in the group chat so far, and continue to add those questions, and I'll pose them to Rita. And you touched on this question a little bit, Rita, in the last section that you were talking about, but I want to make sure that this question is fully answered. This question from Lorraine is there any wisdom in submitting the same item to two different news outlets? If they are, it sounds like this is specifically if one is a hyper-local newspaper and the other is a regional newspaper and online news site. Does that like difference in audience size and audience targeting, does that make a difference in whether or not you should submit the piece to two places at once?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would not advocate for ever submitting it two places at once. I would go for probably the larger newspaper first, if that's really, again, it's all about like who are you trying to target? Who is your target audience? And if that larger newspaper is going to meet your needs better than a small hyper-local newspaper, then that's the one to go towards first. Definitely submit it to the newspaper that you want the most to get published in first. And then if they don't publish it, you can go to your second choice. Sometimes smaller hyper-local newspapers don't care if it's been published in a bigger newspaper and they'll take it. But I think that's kind of rare. So go for your pie-in-the-sky newspaper first. Wait the 10 to 14 days. If you don't hear anything back from them, then submit it to another newspaper. But really, deciding which newspaper to submit to should really be thought about in terms of who am I trying to reach? Who is my target audience? Does that answer the question?
Oh, Lorraine said, what about different media? The question that she's asking.
Sorry, so say that again? It sounded a little bit weird.
Lorraine followed up and said, what if it's an online newspaper versus a print newspaper? Does it matter? Or it sounds like you're saying that like, no matter what, send it to your top outlet first and then submit it to another one after you waited that 10 to 14 days. That they're like really under no circumstance do you want to get it to two places at once.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Newspapers want unique content. Sometimes they'll even get back to you. The newspaper will say, yeah, I will publish this, but we want, exclusive dibs on it. Don't submit it anywhere else. And you have to just say, okay, that's actually what happened with the op-ed for NJ Spotlight that I showed you in the previous slide. NJ Spotlight was like, yeah, we'll definitely publish this, but we want an exclusive. Like, don't submit this anywhere else. And most newspapers really have that attitude, whether they say it or not, because they want to have unique content, right? Newspapers are all competing with each other, essentially, and they don't want their competition having the same content that they have. So they really want to have unique content. I think that if something has been already published and you want to try to submit it to another newspaper, you definitely can give it a go. I'm just not sure how fruitful it would be.
Cool. What about, you talked a little bit about tailoring the piece locally. Do you think, there's a question in the chat from someone from a statewide organization, and she's wondering, can you send that same piece to regional papers? So like if you're a Pennsylvania statewide organization, can you send that piece to like the Pittsburgh area and the Philadelphia area? Can you talk a little bit about how you might like change that piece up?
Yeah. I mean, so you could definitely start with the same body of the piece and still have kind of the same purpose for why you're writing. But I would include that local messaging. If you're writing for a Philadelphia audience, let's say you're writing about water quality, name some of the local rivers, name the Schuylkill, name the Lehigh River, name local parks. Try to give it that local angle, because that's really what's going to help get it published, because that's who their readership is. And the newspapers want to tailor their content to who their readers are, so that their readers are more likely to read that newspaper. So you can definitely have two pieces that kind of have the same, general goal and overall messaging, but tailor it for those local audiences. I wouldn't just have one piece that just talks all about Pennsylvania and then you submit it to both Pittsburgh and Philly. I mean, it's possible that you would get it published because it is talking about Pennsylvania. But I think that, if depending on which newspaper publishes it first, the second newspaper might not want to publish it because it's already been published by, a newspaper in Pittsburgh or Philly. So tailor it as much as you can. Your same points can be the same. Some of your messaging can kind of be the same, but tailor it locally. Talk about how will Philadelphia residents be impacted, or how will Pittsburgh residents be impacted. Maybe there's a local initiative that you can talk about. Try to make it as local as possible.
It looks like there's another question in the group chat that is sort of potentially addressing a separate but related issue. And the question is, have you had any experience submitting to targeted corporate newsletters? And if so, can you share the experience and how that's similar or different to op-ed and LTE submissions?
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of, so we haven't done a lot of submissions to like trade publications or anything like that, or magazines, but that's definitely a salient area to try to submit a piece to. Again, I would start off just by going onto their website and seeing if they have any submission criteria and just following that criteria to a T. Just keep in mind that if it is a trade publication or a magazine, that it is they probably need a lot of lead time before they publish, whereas newspapers will either publish daily or weekly, or if it's like a student newspaper, maybe every other day or something like that, depending. But those trade publications and magazines and things like that, they often have very strict deadlines. So you may even need to get your piece in, 3, 4, 5 months in advance. I did have, at one point CDRW was trying to get something published about some of our policy in a magazine in Delaware, and their lead time was something like 6 months before we could get something published. Follow their guidelines and just keep in mind that it's not going to be as quick and timely if you're trying to move forward policy or something like that. But if it's, if it makes sense for what your goals are and who your target audience is, then you should definitely go for it. If you're trying to reach people, who are involved in farming, then definitely finding out what are the trade publications for farmers and writing something for that, following the guidelines, that might help you achieve your goals better than, just writing to Philly Inquirer or something like that.
Sure. I will just say before I move on to the next question that in my experience in submitting things to publications, it's incredible the number of people who don't even bother like looking at submission guidelines, and just by the simple fact of following, those requests and doing the things that that Rita has recommended, like that just automatically you're more likely to actually get published that way.
Yep.
So there's another question in the chat box that is, how do you counter regularly published conservative opinion pieces that are written by paid writers in the regional Philadelphia newspaper? So it sounds like this could also be like a larger question, like how, like there are people who are paid to write articles for, the big newspapers. How do you go about countering that with the information from your organization if you're you don't have 40 hours a week to write write articles?
Yeah, that's very true. There are some people who do get paid to do that. And there's also people who get paid to leave comments on opinion pieces online that are kind of counteracting what it is you're saying in your LTE or op-ed. It's a very strange world. But I mean, really, so newspapers don't want to see a fight break out in their opinion pages. So you can't, write and say, oh, Joe Schmo wrote about, how great it is to pollute water or something like that. And so I'm writing in response. All you can really do is write a response. And people will read it. So write and take the time to write an LTE, to write an op-ed to some of the critical newspapers that really are, the readers are your audience. Some newspapers really just kind of have a conservative slant and mostly publish conservative LTEs and op-eds. There's only so much you can do to try to convince that audience, because a lot of times people's opinions and views are kind of set in stone, and reading an LTE or op-ed may not change their mind if they kind of have those strong held conservative beliefs. So maybe just thinking about who is your target audience and writing to the newspaper that you feel the audience is going to be most sympathetic to what it is you're writing about. Again, I would not suggest calling out like the writers by names or anything like that. But write an op-ed, write an LTE, try to set the story straight. Now, it's a little bit different if the newspaper themselves are writing actual articles or even editorializing about an issue, in which case, let's say that, so I actually had an instance, I used to work on the anti-fracking campaign in New York, and the Buffalo News was constantly writing these editorials about how it might be a great idea to do a pilot program for fracking. And I worked for an anti-fracking organization, so we were not having that. So in that case, we did write an op-ed that kind of counteracted their editorial, and we said, we're writing in response to this editorial dated blah, blah, blah. And we made our point, but we noticed that they continue to publish articles where they kind of had a pro-fracking slant. And we're like, we really need to get ahead of this. It's not okay for the Buffalo News and for their staff and their writers to be taking the side of, the oil and gas industry. In that case, what we ended up doing is we wrote an ed board memo, and we requested a meeting with the editorial board in order to set the story straight. So that might also be an option for something that you might want to do, is meeting with the editorial board, but that is a whole nother training, and I don't think we have the time to get into how to do that.
Cool. So it looks like we've gotten through all of the questions that are in the chat box. We have maybe 30 seconds left in case there's a last minute question someone wants to put up in there. I think, Rita, do you want to go back to the slide that has your contact information on it?
Sure. yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about how to submit something, if you're using the best practices. Again, I really think, if you follow most of the tips that I gave you today, that it'll be easier for you to get stuff published. It's definitely helped to get our things published, over the last couple of years I've been with CDRW.
Great. Thanks so much, Rita. This has been really helpful.
Yeah, thank you guys.